Our liberties we prize, and our rights we will maintain. This is Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast, where we tell stories about the contribution Iowans and the state of Iowa has made to advance the civil rights movement. Past stories are being told, present actions will be highlighted, and preparation for the future will be discussed. Here is your host, Erick and Nganyange.
Welcome to the Iowa Civil Rights History Podcast. My guest today is Dr. David Brodnax, best known by his students as Dr. B. He is the history professor at Trinity Christian College in Chicago, Illinois. He holds a Bachelor of History from Wesleyan University, Master's and PhD in History from Northwestern University. To top it off, he holds a law degree from the University of Iowa. This is a part 2 of our conversation, which will be on selective topics of Black history in the state of Iowa in the 19th century. There was other 2 cases in Keokuk County that is that similar to like Alexander Clark case?
Similar in some ways, yeah. So after the Clark decision does not say that you have to integrate all the schools. What it says is that school districts cannot force children to attend a certain school based on race.
Okay.
Right. And so there's some school districts that integrate it to different degrees, right? Davenport integrates, Mount Pleasant integrates fairly quickly. I think the schools in Clarinda down in southwest Iowa integrate fairly quickly. There are some other places where it's more of a struggle. Dubuque is certainly one of those places. Dubuque has its own history of sort of, reactionary, racial opposition. And so not surprising that the school district in Dubuque refused to integrate until the parents said, well, maybe we'll just bring a lawsuit. And then they did. But Keokuk, this is the southernmost part of the state, right? This is, I remember going to Keokuk and I'm standing in Iowa and I look this way and I can see Missouri and I turn my head in the other direction, I can see Illinois, right? It's right there on the border. And so it had the largest Black population in the state. It was, at one time, Keokuk's population was 25% Black, right? So biggest Black community in the entire state. This is one of the first Blacks in organized baseball played for a team in Keokuk.
Oh, really?
Bud Fowler, who's now in the National Baseball Hall of Fame.
Oh, I did not know that.
People think Jagger Robinson was the first. Jagger Robinson's the first to reintegrate baseball. In the 1870s and 1880s, there are some Blacks in organized white baseball. There's people tend to know more about Fleetwood Walker, I think was his name, who played for Toledo, Ohio, used to have a major league team, right?
Okay.
Hard to imagine now, but there was a team in Toledo, Ohio, right? And so he and his brother played for them. But there was a team in Keokuk as well, and Bud Fowler played for that team. And he's not from this area, how does he end up playing for a team in Keokuk? My argument is same reason why Branch Rickey decided, we should have a Black player in Brooklyn. There's a big Black population that will come out to see this guy play, that will buy tickets.
Yeah,
right?
with 25%.
Right. So, but that's here in Iowa, right? So Keokuk has this big Black population, but it also has massive levels of white resistance, to any kind of racial equality. And so Keokuk actually builds a new Black school after the Clark decision. That's how much they weren't trying to hear it, right? Like, we're going to build a new Black school, which they called the African school. And part of that goes back to the same dilemma the Black parents face. Do we want our kids to go to this new school, which has these 4 Black teachers where, they're not going to be abused, or do we want to send them to school with these kids whose parents we know have
they
all these
want them.
Right, exactly. They don't want them. Well, there's 2 families in particular for whom the decision was somewhat different. So there's a guy named, and sometimes I mix up the 2 kids. They're Charles Dove and Gerard Smith. If I remember correctly, one of them was a high school student, right?
Okay.
So there was a few high school kids at this Black school, but they're all in the same classroom with a bunch of much younger kids. So they're not being given any kind of meaningful curriculum. And so his parents wanted him to get, a quality high school education. If the problem wasn't, teachers didn't know what they were doing, but I mean, if you put high school kids in there with kids who were 11, 12, 13, the high school kid, you got to teach to the lowest common denominator, and so the high school kids are not getting a quality education. So they tried to send him to Keokuk High School, and they got turned away. The other kid was, if I'm not mistaken, a 3rd grader. He lived far from where the Black school was, and he also had chronic health concerns. He was not able to physically make the trip to go to the black school every day, right?
Yeah.
So, there's the old joke about it. When I was your age, I used to walk uphill to school both ways in the snow and all that. Well, he actually did have to walk to school, right? Which was, of course, part of Susan Clark's problem, right?
Yeah.
Is that the Clarks lived in downtown Muscatine, but the black school was on the outskirts of town. Well, this third grader's family, they lived pretty far from the school, and he was not physically able to walk. So they wanted him to go to his neighborhood school, got turned away. And these are also both prosperous families. One of the families, the father was a minister. These are families that have the means to try to do this thing. They bring suit, and in 1875, the Iowa Supreme Court, one decision's in the summer, the other one's in the winter, and these decisions are very short. The court basically just says, why are you wasting our time? We already talked about this with the Clark decision 7 years ago. Integrate the schools. Get out of here, right?
Oh, so these were two different cases kind of brought in at the same time?
These are two different cases brought at the same time, decided separately, right? So this is not like a class action lawsuit, but both sets of families bring the cases at the same time, raising similar issues, right? So
was it against the same school district?
It was against the same school district.
Oh, wow.
Right. And so in the case, the school district said for the high school student, we don't have enough room in the high school. Like we don't have any seats left. Problem was they admitted several more students to the high school after they turned him away. They tried to bring that argument. There were so many arguments. They tried to say that Clark wasn't actually the law because there was a dissenting opinion in Clark, and so that was really the law. That's not how dissenting opinions work. They accused the families of, I think I remember this exact quote because it's just so spectacular, but it's something of, they feel themselves to be aristocratic and above their colored brethren. Like basically, like the other black families are perfectly happy with this black school. Y'all just out here being bougie, right? And so, like, they made all kinds of arguments. And these things don't, if you look at the decision, these arguments aren't really all raised. But I've also read, like, the district court briefs and, like, all the different, documents that are available. And, these are all the arguments that they make. And the Iowa Supreme Court just finally said, no.
Yeah.
We ruled on this. Get out of here. So, but then here's what happens after that. All four of those black teachers who are working in the black school, a year later, none of them are working in Keokuk anymore.
Why is that?
Because the black school is gone.
Integrated.
Yeah, the black school. Well, the school doesn't close; it becomes just another school as part of the Keokuk school district. So now the schools are integrated, but neither Keokuk nor any other school district in the state was going to hire black teachers to teach integrated classrooms.
Yeah,
and this is something that comes up in the Iowa Bystander 20 years later when they're talking about how in Iowa our kids grow up going to integrated schools. And then they want to be teachers, and they got to leave Iowa to get jobs because Iowa schools will not hire black teachers. The only exceptions to that were the few black majority towns, much of Kynok, eventually Buxton. There's a few other places a few other mining camps that are black majority. But aside from that, it's possible that there was black teachers hired in Mount Pleasant. The evidence is conflicted on that. But for the most part, like you see these black kids growing up in Iowa, born and raised, going to the schools, and then they move to Missouri to go teach in segregated schools, which they have never been to in their life, because Missouri will at least hire black teachers to teach in black schools, but Iowa will not hire black teachers to teach
in integrated school.
Not until the 20th century. So those four teachers all lost their jobs.
Was that the biggest problem, in your opinion, with the integration? Like black business going away, teachers lose their job?
I think that is part of it. I mean, that's, to go back to the whole Negro Leagues thing, right? Some black institutions are thriving, even now that we're now close to 60 years after the Civil Rights Act and, like legalized integration under the law, or legalized desegregation under the law, I should say, right? So others, like the Negro Leagues, are just gone. Of course, there are people who make the conscious decision, to say, I'm going to support black businesses. I'm going to try to spend my money in black spaces, right?
Yeah.
But people, you at least have that option now. I mean, one of the things that I know about is like with black attorneys, for instance, like the Clarks. Black attorneys had it really hard because a lot of white Americans didn't want to hire black attorneys. But you know who else didn't want to hire black attorneys was African Americans.
Yeah.
And it wasn't at any sort of sense of deep-seated, like internalized self-hatred or anything. It was, this person has to represent me before a white jury and a white judge. Whoever I hire has to represent me in that space. and they're not going to respect the black lawyer.
Yeah.
So I want a white lawyer, right?
Yeah. And I want to win.
Right, and I want to win. And even though this person may be perfectly capable, in Alexander Clark, or if you want to go to Chicago, you've got Ida B. Wells' husband, Ferdinand Barnett. I'm required to point out, like a fellow Northwestern grad, right? But I got my two alma maters that I just can't help but shout out, right?
Yeah.
But you got somebody like that, like, okay, Ferdinand Barnett, you're brilliant and knowledgeable and talented, but the judges aren't going to respect you. The jury's not going to respect you. So I'm going to go find a white lawyer, right? So there certainly were lots of problems, in those days. But one of the things that happened, and like I said, many black institutions have survived and thrived, in the days of integration. But there's certain things that we have lost.
The bystander started in 1894?
1894, yes.
Give us the rundown of this newspaper and why it was so important for black people in the state of Iowa.
It's important in so many ways. It's important. It was important at the time, and it's important to us as historians today because it is such a valuable, treasure trove of information.
Oh,
right?
yeah,
So
you're right.
It's a little bit about newspapers in general back then. So it's the Iowa State Bystander, right? So it's based out of Des Moines, and it definitely has a sort of the Des Moines-centric focus, but it was always intentionally a state newspaper. One of the things that they did was they had local agents in different towns all over Iowa and even beyond Iowa, like Galesburg, like Grand Forks, North Dakota. A group of black Iowans moved to Phoenix, and so now they've got agents in Phoenix, Arizona.
Oh, wow.
They were getting dispatches from Tuskegee, Alabama, because an Iowan went to Tuskegee University. So they've got these agents all over the state, and their job is to, number one, try to sell subscriptions. Number two, collect on people's subscriptions, but also to collect news about what's going on in the black community. You've got all these different sections with names like Burlington Brieflet, Davenport Notes, Clarinda News, right? Oskaloosa Brieflets, things like that. Cedar Rapids Budgetarian. So every issue, once a week, you get to find out what's going on in black communities all over the state and to a lesser extent in the broader Midwest. And these are things, sometimes it's big, like, the Emancipation Day celebration is coming up, but it's also the sick list. Like Mrs. Johnson fell down the stairs, but she's expected to make a full recovery. Or this, such and such just got married, and here's who was the guests. Or such and such is visiting from Montana, right? Or this person's getting ready to go visit their cousin in Omaha, right? It's like, to use a fancy word, it's quotidian. It's wonderfully quotidian, right? Because these are people who don't show up in the historical record. They're on the census, as long as you can catch them in a census year in a specific place, you'll find them there and you'll get that 10-year snapshot of their life. But they're not showing up in the white newspapers otherwise because we weren't talked about in the white newspapers unless, somebody broke the law.
Is that how you guys find out, like, some of the famous black people came to Iowa? Like, because you say, Frederick Douglass or Booker T. Washington came to Iowa this year, this date. Is that where you guys get the information from?
The people who were really big, like a Frederick Douglass, like a Booker T. Washington, like an Ida B. Wells, they would have been mentioned in the white press as well.
Okay.
But people who were, to quote from the comedian Jay Farrell, people who were black famous, they would not have shown up in the white newspapers, right? The other thing the newspapers would talk about is, we've been talking about education, they would talk about who was graduating from school. They would say, like, here are all the black students at the local high school this year. Right. Yeah. Here's all the black graduates we have, right? Things like that. So it's the bystander was rooting for everybody black, right? If you are black and you are doing a thing, and we're going to talk about it. And so people at the time, if you live in that community, then you're like, oh, here's what's going on in Cedar Rapids. Here's what's going on in Muscatine, whatever, right? If you're from elsewhere in the state, maybe you know some of those people, so you see what they're up to. Even if you don't know them, there's still a sense of camaraderie and of connection because you're in whatever town you're in somewhere else in the state that's like overwhelmingly white. You don't get to travel like all to different parts of the state, but you get to see here's what's going on in other black communities. Here's what's going on with their church life, right? Yeah. With their gatherings, things like that, right? Yeah. So there's that sense of connection that comes from that. And then for us as historians, like I said, this is where I get to like sort of follow everyday people through their everyday lives. People who may not have ever been famous. People who did manual labor, right? People who maybe owned a small business, and they're not going to show up anywhere else in historical record, but I get to see what they're doing on a weekly basis. I get to see that they're an officer in some club at the church, right? I get to see, that they're in this, community institution or that one, right? I get to see what they'd like to do for fun, right? Such and such, such and such just bought a bicycle and they're just riding it all over Burlington, and good for them, right? And so, wow. It is so fascinating.
So this was everything for Black community at that time.
I would say so.
In terms of communication.
Yeah. And this is just like the local news reports, right? This is to say nothing of the editorials, right? Yeah. So you've got articles about like local politics, focusing mainly on Des Moines. But, because Des Moines is the capital, that ends up being state politics by default. I'm focusing on the 1890s, so I've read about like all the stuff with the 1896, election, when Black Iowans got behind William McKinley, who ends up getting a Republican nomination, with statewide offices for governor, for senator, with local races, just sort of commenting on that. Right now I'm reading articles about the Spanish-American War and the efforts, first to try to get a Black company from Des Moines, and then to try to have them have a Black officer, right? And the newspaper is just fiercely advocating for that. We fought for this country in the Civil War, even though we didn't get to have any Black officers. We want for this company to be led by a Black officer, right? So commenting on international issues, there's a lot of, with the Spanish-American War, commenting on here's how race relations are different in Cuba, right? And just really championing General Antonio Maceo, who's the Black Cuban general in the Cuban War of Independence, and just cheering for him and lamenting his loss when he's killed in battle. This is our military history, right? Unfortunately, during this time period, there's a genocide going on in Armenia, right? Where Armenia at that point in time is part of the Ottoman Empire. And a lot of people know about the Armenian genocide of the 1910s, but there's also one in the 1890s. And so the newspapers commenting on that and saying, this is terrible, but it would also be nice if all these white Americans who care so much about violence against Armenians could also take some interest in Black lynching in the South. Why do you care about what happens to people in another country, but you turn a blind eye to what happens to your own people in your own country? It's commenting on like everything, and talking about politics in terms of we're not going to just sort of line up blindly behind the Republican Party, and you're not going to be able to get us to vote for you just by saying, hey, we ended slavery. You're going to have to actually like present a platform, for civil rights in the South, for racial equality in the North, right? And in the North where we can vote and are voting, like we insist, in Iowa there might not be enough of us to get elected to public office in a lot of places, but we want patronage positions. We want more. This is back when, a lot of positions like police officer were appointed. We want more Black cops, right? We want more, Black sanitation workers. We want more Black people in good government jobs. You want our votes, what do we get for it? And the bystander, it was firmly Republican, very strongly against the Democratic Party. And I know you've talked about this in other episodes, but just to remind the listeners, the Republicans used to be the more liberal party on race relations. The Democrats were the more conservative party on issues of race, right? Yep. So the bystander was not saying let's consider the Democratic Party, but it was saying we need to hold the Republican Party accountable, because what's happening is, the Democrats hate us, and the Republicans take us for granted. So we have to prevent them from doing that. Yeah, this was a thriving Black newspaper for decades in a state that never had Black folks were never more than a few percentage population. Yeah, because I don't think he ever even reached 10%. Never has. There's been a few places in Iowa that have been, there's only been 3 Black majority areas that I'm aware of, right? Yeah. Well, 4. Munchakinock, Buxton, and then there was 2 other mining camps. I think one was called Carver and the other one's called Given. Okay. And those are both fairly close to Des Moines. That's it. You've got a few places where, it's maybe 10%, maybe 25%, like a Clarinda, like Keokuk. Waterloo eventually gets to be, I think today Waterloo has the highest percentage Black population. Yeah. But, we're not talking about Chicago, where you have a Chicago Defender. We're not talking about Detroit, which eventually becomes a Black majority city. But in spite of all that, the bystander still survives and does very well for a long time.
Yeah. Do you think we'll still have a shot today to kind of bring something like that back?
That's a good question. I mean, we know that it's just in general, it's hard for newspapers
to survive.
So even something like a Washington Post, a New York Times, a Chicago Sun-Times, or Tribune, they're not doing as well as they used to.
Do you think because that generation that used to read newspaper is kind of disappear, or do you think because we have so many different avenues to get the news?
I think it's a second thing. I mean, certainly people still read the news. And, of course, like I said, there's people who, they do their own research, but there's people who read legitimate, news outlets online, but it's free. Newspapers overall are struggling so much. I hate to be pessimistic and say that it will be hard I certainly don't think that a physical newspaper would be able to come into existence and survive. It would have to be an online paper.
Online, yeah.
Right. And with that, I think it would be hard. But, I mean, we know that there are legitimate black news outlets, right? There's places where, you've got websites like The Root, The Root, for instance. You've got Atlanta Black Star, I think. So there's places where you can go to still receive that information.
The case of Emma Carger versus Northwestern Union Packet Company, the transportation. Did she get thrown out of the first class, or she got refused to be served?
Both of the above. This case is just so important. I mean, I almost feel like she needs a movie. I mean, that's how just fascinating this is. And I also think about my own journey in terms of how I've learned more about her over the years. So Emma Carger is from Quincy, Illinois, which is, it's a Mississippi River town.
Okay.
Downstate, so it's not bordering Iowa. It's on the Illinois-Missouri border, right? But she's from there, and she's a school teacher. She's only about 20 years old, and she comes to Keokuk to visit friends, and she wants to buy a ticket to take the steamboat back home. She goes to the ticket counter, and the agent won't sell her a ticket. She wants to buy a second-class ticket. The agent says, I will not sell you a second-class ticket because first and second class are for whites only. She gets a white man to buy her a ticket. Now, I should mention also, Emma Carger is extremely light-skinned. I have never been able to find a picture of her. Maybe if I went to the Quincy archives and dug around in there, I'd find one. But all of the records describe her as being extremely light-skinned to the point of almost being able to pass for white. So a white man buys her a second-class ticket. So now she's got a second-class ticket, which means that she's entitled to sit in to go to the dining hall and get a meal. Third-class ticket means you can only go to your rooms. First or second-class means you get a meal in the dining hall. She goes into the dining hall, and they say, we're not going to serve you because you're black. She sits down at the table anyway. One of the people, it's with a bunch of white women, including the captain's wife. They all say, I will not eat with a Negro, and they get up and leave. Now, the fascinating thing is this is a good example of how people find their own quiet ways to resist, right? It's not always about I'm gonna pick up a sign and I'm gonna go march, right?
Yeah.
Or I'm gonna go make a speech, right? Because, like I said, the white people sitting at the table with her, they get up and walk away, but the black workers, they start serving her food.
Oh.
Now, the record doesn't say anything about them saying a word. They don't say, I stand with Emma Carger, or they don't say, this is for our people. They just do their job, but they do it with her. And
silent resistance.
Silent resistance, right?
Yeah.
So, I mean, history is filled with so much of that, of people who just find their ways to say, I'm going to stand up for what's right. I'm going to find my way. I'm black, I'm vulnerable, this is a good job, but I don't want to lose it. So I'm not going to say a word, but I'm still going to find a way to have your back, right? To have our back, right? So Captain comes over and says, get up. She refuses. He starts trying to drag her away from the table.
Oh, physically?
Right? Physically.
Oh, wow.
She grabs onto the table, and then he finally punches her on the hands and on the head. He assaults this 20-year-old woman school teacher, right? And then she's removed, and she spends the rest of the trip in her room. She gets back to Quincy, and she wants to sue the steamboat company. There's a couple of local lawyers who don't want to take the case, right? Because there had been a recent similar case in Illinois, and the black plaintiff had lost. And they said, well, now of course she's not going to be bringing the case in Illinois, but they say, well, if this didn't work in Illinois, it's not going to work in Iowa, so we're not taking the case. But she gets a white attorney in Keokuk to take the case. And this is someone who, a few years later, becomes the mayor of Keokuk. I have a theory that he was doing this in part, maybe he was doing this partly because he thought it was the right thing, but I think that he was maybe also trying to get the black vote. But he takes the case. And so she sues the Steamboat Company for assault and battery. Steamboat Company says, we have the right to segregate people based on race. And this is our custom, right? And you can't make us violate our custom. The district court does not agree. So she wins at the district court. They appeal, the Steamboat Company appeals to the Iowa Supreme Court. And in 1873, the Iowa Supreme Court rules that you cannot discriminate on common carriers, trains, steamboats. There's no like cars or airplanes yet, but common carriers, public, common transportation, if you will, you cannot discriminate based on race. Now, part of what makes this fascinating is me sort of trying to figure out who is Emma Kosher. Like I said, she's very light-skinned. Her father is a white man. Her mother is a black woman of mixed ancestry. And, and when you look at like the district court records, she makes a couple different arguments, but one of them is even if it's okay to discriminate against people, because they're black, that shouldn't apply to me because I'm not actually black.
Oh.
Now she doesn't say she's white. She says I'm colored, and that's different from black. Right? She's trying to go like South Africa.
South Africa, right, yeah. Right. And that's what I was thinking about.
I'm not black, I'm colored.
I'm colored,
right?
yeah.
And she brings as witnesses some of her black friends from Quincy who say, oh, yeah, she used to be black, but now she's colored because she doesn't hang with black people anymore. But then at the same time, she teaches at the black school in Quincy. I tried to figure out, is this a reflection of how she actually saw herself and saw the world, or was this a legal strategy? Because we know 20 years later, Homer Plessy used a very similar strategy in New Orleans, Louisiana, where he says, racial segregation is wrong, but even if it's not wrong, it shouldn't apply to me because I'm only part black.
Yeah, because he was super light-skinned too. Yeah.
Right, and this is someone who very clearly identified with his black heritage and was a leader in the black community in a lot of ways. So there's no question that he was using it as a strategy, right? He's trying to eliminate racial restrictions under the law by saying, well, they're stupid in the first place because who's black and who's white. So what I was trying to figure out, is Emma Kosher doing the same thing, or is this a reflection of how she actually felt? And I really didn't know until I found some articles about her and her family in the Quincy newspapers. So her mom, back when Emma was only about 10 years old, her mom helped to organize the Emancipation Proclamation celebration in Quincy. Right, January 1st, 1863 is when it goes into effect, and the Koshers are there. Right, and her mom was an organizer of that. Her mom was active in Quincy's black church for decades. There's a letter about the case that's published in Frederick Douglass's newspaper. All the way on the East Coast, there's word about this case, right? It's the only article in that entire issue that's not about the East Coast, right? Away out here in Keokuk, Iowa, here's young Emma Kosher who's trying to do this thing, right? And she talks about how, I don't want to just win for me, I want to win for our race. And then when she's looking back on it 20 years later in 1890, she's saying, I did that for our people. When she dies in the 1920s, she's actually quite prosperous, and it wasn't because they paid school teachers well, but her mom had bought a few properties, and then her mom left those properties to Emma. And so then Emma used the investment for that and bought some more. So she's doing all right for herself by the time that she dies. In her will, she said that she never has any children of her own. She says, I want my properties to be sold, and I want the money to be used to build a retirement home for former slaves.
Oh, wow.
So this is clearly...
Was a strategy.
Yeah. I think it was a strategy. This is not someone who's trying to say, oh, I'm not black, I'm colored, right? So you should treat me... You can do what you want to them black people, but you got to treat me differently. Like, I don't think that she was doing that at all. The answer to my question comes through these additional articles that I found. She is just absolutely fascinating, right?
Wow. There was another case just like that in Iowa in 1889 in Shepherd.
Right. So, another case involving a common carrier. So there's a...
So hang on. How do we have another case a few years later when this one was already been decided?
It's a good question. So until the early 1880s, there's a federal law called the Civil Rights Act, and it bans racial segregation in places like hotels and restaurants and parks and things like that. In the early 1880s, the United States Supreme Court strikes this law down, says it's unconstitutional, right? So Iowa then immediately passes a state civil rights act, which says we're going to restore on a state level all those rights that have been lost on a federal level. 1883, a barber from Cedar Rapids named Joseph Bolin is turned away from a skating rink. They say, well, you're black, so you can't come in here. Right. Now, there was an advertisement for the skating rink that said, this rink is open to the public. So he tries to get in. And they said, oh, no, my bad. We meant the white public. They turn him away. He brings suit. The Iowa Supreme Court rules on a technicality that, the law doesn't actually apply. Right. They say, well, the law refers to places of amusement, and a skating rink is not a place of amusement. Yeah. So then here's what happens with the Shepherd case. Once coal mining gets big in sort of south central Iowa, Albia, Ottumwa, Oskaloosa, eventually you got Mushakinuk, which eventually leads to Buxton. Yeah. You get a very large black population down there, right, including entrepreneurs. So Fanny Shepherd and her husband, they owned a boarding house. Her husband worked in the mines part-time. I think they might have owned another business at some point. So these are people who are doing all right for themselves. They're riding on the train one day, and they get separated. Mother and child get separated from the father. She finds herself on the train, without her husband, and the conductor forces her to get off the train. She missed, I think it was something like she misses her stop, and she wants the train to let her off in the next stop, and the conductor won't stop. And then finally he says, okay, fine, well, you have to get off. And he forces her off the train. And this is in the Iowa summer heat. So she's walking along the train tracks with her baby until she finally collapses, and she sues the train company for distress, right? Because she's bedridden for a month after that, trying to recover. So the baby did okay, but she ends up not being in good health after that. So she sues the railroad company, but she does not sue on racial grounds. And my theory is that she's afraid that because of this Bolin case from a few years earlier, that they're not going to rule in her favor based on racial grounds. She sues on the grounds that I was unjustly forced off of this train, right? And the only thing that she says about race is to mention the racial slur. The railroad company says, well, we didn't do it because she was black. And then her attorney says, we didn't say you did it because she was black. We just said you did it. I think that this is another, you were talking about strategy. I think this is another strategy. We're not going to say that this is racial because there's already precedent that makes it hard to win a case based on that. We're just going to say, based on the facts, you forced a woman with a young child to get off a train where she didn't have to get off. Somebody who had bought a ticket, forced to get off the train, and forced her to walk in the Iowa heat, and now she's suffered physical stress because of that, right? And she wins, but I think that she wins because even though she's clearly being the victim of racism, she doesn't say this is because of race. Yeah, Fanny Shepherd, also a fascinating case. And wow. All of the legal briefs that are about that case, like all of the, you just look at the final decision, and it says a few things, but there's always so much more information in the information that's provided, like at district court and so forth. And so this is also a great look into black life in these mining towns in south central Iowa, because Fanny Shepherd is sort of talking about, this is what I do, right? This is where I do it. There's other people who take the witness stand and say, this is what I do for a living, and this is where I do it. And so these legal briefs, this is before the bystanders. So this is a great snapshot into black life at that time, right? People who otherwise wouldn't show up in, they're not showing up in the white newspapers, right?
Yeah, that's true. And all these were won at the district level court.
All of the
those two.
Yeah, all these people we've talked about won at the district level, and then the other side appealed, and then the Iowa Supreme Court ultimately ruled in their favor. Yeah.
Let's get to if you can just give a summary about case of Ralph Montgomery.
This is the second case ever decided by the Iowa Supreme Court. This is before Iowa was even a state, 1839, 1840. There was a custom in the slave states back then. We tend to think of the slave owner and then the slaves, the slave holder and the enslaved people, and you are forced to work for the person who legally owns you. Sometimes there were slaveholders who, for various reasons, would hire their slaves out to somebody else, would hire their enslaved people out to somebody else, or in some cases they'd say, I'm going to allow you to go someplace else and find work and make money, and then you can buy your freedom eventually. This would be a case where like maybe you own this person, but you don't have any work for them to do. So they're actually at this point an economic liability. Like, okay, I still got to like feed you, I still got to house you, in a very inferior way to be sure, but still like you're not getting equal, housing and shelter and food and all that. But I still got to pay for that. You go off somewhere else, then you got to pay your own bills, and then you can make some money. And then I'm going to get all your money anyway because you're going to use it to buy yourself, right? So Ralph Montgomery is enslaved in Missouri, and he and his slaveholder make an agreement where he can go up to Dubuque and find work, then, come back in 5 years and, hand over the money, and then he's free. Ralph Montgomery goes up there, goes up to Dubuque, but he doesn't want to come back, right? He's living free, he's earning money, and then when the slaveholder says you have to come back, he says, I'm not. So the slaveholder sends, we call them bounty hunters, right? Yeah. Slave catchers, but that's what a slave catcher is, right? They're a bounty hunter. Sends them up to Dubuque to drag him away, put him on a boat, bring him back to Missouri. Montgomery's neighbor, who's an Irish immigrant and is doing fairly well for himself, sees what's happening, intervenes, and says, well, let's take this to the justice of the peace and see what and let them decide, right? It ends up going to the Iowa Supreme Court, and again, second case ever heard by this court. The Iowa Supreme Court says to the master, when you let Ralph Montgomery come to the state, right? He's not a fugitive. He didn't run off. You let him come up here. When you let him come to a free state, you freed him. He is now legally free. Right? Somebody runs off, we have a fugitive slave law, you have the right to get them back. Yeah. But if you say to someone, I'm going to let you go to a free state, they're free.
You can't come back and try to put them back in slavery.
Right, you can't try to put them back in slavery, right? Which, to kind of put this in a bigger context, this is essentially the argument that Dred and Harriet Scott make 15 years later.
Wow.
Right? Their master takes them to Illinois and Iowa and Minnesota. Not quite the same set of circumstances, but they argue when you brought us to a free state, you freed us. Now, the U.S. Supreme Court declines to follow, Ralph as precedent, but that's the second case ever decided by the Supreme Court. Wow. Now, less than 2 years later, there's also another black man named Nathaniel Morgan who's lynched in Dubuque, right? So this is sort of the promise of early Iowa, but also the sort of the realization that promise is not going to come true, right? Yeah. The very same community freed Ralph Montgomery, lynched Nathaniel Morgan. So yeah, that's the Ralph decision, 1839.
Wow. Well, Dr. B, thank you very much for your time, sir.
Thank you.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, this has been great. And thank you. I love listening to the podcast. So, keep doing it. And,
thank you.
I will keep listening. Yeah.
Thank you very much.